The Chicago home series definitely opened some eyes this weekend, that's for sure. The final result we witness is the Dallas Empire hosting what is now their second CDL championship, as they are currently the only team to now exist in that category. However, with that accomplishment also comes now the comparisons, right? Are they better than this team? Does this tournament hold as much weight as this one? Does their second title mean more than this title? But most importantly, out of all of those, the major comparison comes to other rosters that exist. And the question remains, are the Dallas Empire the new number one team in the world, right? I mean, coming into this event, there was no question who the number one team was at the time, right? There was no question who was at the time the number one team in the game. It was Atlanta, right? Chicago hadn't been looking their best most recently, losing to Florida in back to back events, missing the grand finals. Empire, for example, they have a shaky Dallas homestand, going to a near game five with the Gorillas, going game five with Toronto, and later losing 3-1 to Minnesota. There was no question who the number one team coming into this event was, and we all knew it. It was the Atlanta FaZe. But I want to revisit the run that Dallas made here at the Chicago homestand, because I was quick to say it. This is an event that Dallas needed to do well in. This was an event that they had to do well in. Why? Because they got a pass in group play, right? We cannot ignore what was the initial stages of this event. Group A, you had a better looking London now with Shawnee. Based on scrimmages, it looked as if they were playing much better and improved Royal Ravens. A much better subliner roster as we expected. Now with Mac Melts, that team looks rejuvenated, looks different, could easily start to raise when it comes down to power rankings. Obviously, you have Chicago and Atlanta coming in, at least for me, my number one and my number two team in power rankings. And then for Dallas, right on the other side, they had the Gorillas, who haven't looked stellar, an improving Seattle, and a very questionable OGLA. Would they be the same team that we saw them in Los Angeles? Would they be a different team now with this online atmosphere, the rumored roster changes of Dashy, et cetera, starting to function in? There was, and for the most part, Dallas had teams that were beatable, right? Dallas had teams that they were undefeated against these rosters in their season so far. They had yet to lose to any one of these three teams. This was their tournament to make a run because they didn't have to worry about the early gauntlet. It was strictly focusing on semis and finals for them. Not that they didn't focus on their group play matches, but you didn't really have to worry as much, right? There were cautionary things about this Chicago team. There were even some cautions coming through from Atlanta as well, and clearly for the Chicago statement, the prediction that I made started to follow through. They get taken down by the subliners in a game five, right? And let's go and break down this run a little bit more for Dallas, because like I said, they don't have to worry about the early gauntlet. When it comes down to their group stage, they slide past OGLA, looking great in respawns, which is something that they worked on coming into this event. Had a chance to talk with good old Rambo Ray, the coach of Dallas Empire. He told me kind of right before we did the interview, hey, we're working on respawns for next event. It's unacceptable the way that we looked when it came down to this one. Search and Destroy is a game mode that we've relied on. Now it's time to improve the respawns. And when it came down to OGLA, only problem, lose 6-1 in the Arklov S&D, which is somewhat surprising, but you don't really put a whole lot of weight into it considering the way that the other three game modes really started to go. Dallas later faces off against Seattle, which was a much closer series. They dropped the initial game one. The game three was incredibly close and probably should have gone the way of Surge. And Dallas, as always, clutch up on Hackney to win 3-1. Some people worried about the team at this point. Had they really started to improve? I saw a few people kind of at the end of day two saying both Chicago and Dallas starting to show a little bit of a sign of struggle, but for the most part, I wasn't too cautious. I really was. I wasn't too worried about them at this point. I think they were kind of expected to roll through Seattle. However, it wasn't the most convincing, and I get that. But in what I expected to be a 3-1 victory for Dallas in the semis, turned out to be a 3-0 versus the Chicago Huntsmen to make it into the finals. Dallas made what was pretty much a very hype series, right? This is a storyline. This has been two teams, prior teammates that have gone up against each other. This was meant to be intense. And Dallas made it a snooze fest. They made it a what was supposed to be a very hype fourth series versus these two teams, in which Chicago has won the last three of them. It wasn't all that interesting. It was an incredibly one-sided affair, and the way that they won this so dominantly, I believe, was through the vetoes. Right? I know I start to kind of make this known a little bit on Twitter, but the same thing kind of applies here. Ramaza Hardpoint, not historically a great choice for Chicago, most likely in my mind something that Dallas was prepared for. They know the vetoes. They know how they work versus a team like Chicago. They faced off against them 3 times. That you'd like to think that they probably have a good plan coming into this series. Chicago, I don't think we're as aware of that. Ramaza Hardpoint, that one goes through. Not historically a great one for Chicago. S&D on Gunrunner, that map has secretly been what Dallas likes. This was the Game 5 map they won to win their tournament back in LA. This has been a map that they have liked for a while. Hackney domination. While both teams have dominated each other on this map previously, you still kind of don't get that same dramatic affair that you do when it comes down to series prior. If you're Chicago, you want to have some really, really good maps, right? This one has gone both ways. Hackney Hardpoint for the Game 4. Chicago had beaten Dallas previously on it, but the Empire had won it 4 straight times coming into this series, being masters of P5. That has been one of their major successes, has been their ability to clutch up on Hackney Hardpoint. And if we would have gone to the Game 5 Arkalov Peak, which we didn't even go to the Game 4 Hackney Hardpoint, but if we would have gone to the Game 5 Arkalov Peak S&D, both teams had taken this map versus one another, but it's a map that when Chicago took it, it went round 11. When Dallas took it, it was a 6-1. I didn't really like any of these maps for Chicago. I really wasn't a big fan of the vetoes for them. And if you're looking at this from a previous standpoint, when you have faced off against this team 3 times, you don't have any maps outside of one where you have beaten them a majority of the time on. You had one map that of which you have beat them previously. The others had either not been played before or it was a 1-1 score line. There was no real major maps that historically went the way of Huntsman, which tells me Dallas were prepared. Dallas had done their homework, and Dallas had a plan of attack coming in to this series. They looked like a well-oiled machine, and Chicago looked outclassed, and they looked like they were lost, which is the worry that I had for this team coming into this event and coming into this series, right? This was a problem that I kind of had already originated about Chicago. I said, you need to wake up. The skill is only going to get you so far. You have some solid rosters in front of you, and if you're not careful, you could drop to some of these teams, right? They dropped to New York. They drop here to Dallas. It was expected. And to be honest, I thought Chicago would have played better than this, and they didn't. Dallas then moves on to the finals versus a roster that they were previously 0-2 in series against and 0-6 in maps on the year. For me, Dallas winning the Game 1 Hardpoint here versus Atlanta was a huge one for them, right? Versus Chicago and Atlanta so far on the season, they were 0-5 in Game 1 Hardpoints and were 0-7 in overall Hardpoints, right? That definitely kind of adds to the momentum, you'd like to think, for a team that has constantly struggled against the big dogs. When it comes down to the first and fourth respawn, they had yet to win one, which means that they were relying on an occasional dom. They were relying on search and destroys at certain moments. And when we talk about search and destroy versus the Atlanta phase, they lose what was probably one of the best maps that we've had all season long, in which it comes down to a round 11, 1 versus 1 between what was master and apprentice, if you will, Clayster and Simp. Atlanta get it done. Dallas, though, turns a round 11 into, for me, what was the highlight of the tournament for them, one of the most dominant sides of Hackney domination we have ever seen. And versus a team that looked great at this in Chicago. People will forget leading into this series. Remember this. This is the swing mode that Atlanta was looking for. We talked about Game 3 is always labeled the swing mode. Atlanta were eyeing up that Game 3 to go their way. They clutch up in the search and destroy. Great. Now we have momentum coming into the dom. that doesn't happen, right? FaZe previously, and these two last matches that they have coming into this one, they played Hackney Dom. And when they did, they had a 106-52 half versus Seattle in the semis. And their group, they went on a 114-55 run versus New York. This map was one that Atlanta thought was going to go their way, and one that they probably intended on going their way, one that they thought would allow for them to get the edge versus Dallas and at least have that game 5 to fall back on. But that was not the case whatsoever. This map was dominated by Dallas. We heard the comms. We saw the way that they played. It was picture perfect Hackney Dom, and the way that they played on the bad side was actually incredible. It really was. This was, like I said, this was a map that they were relying on in FaZe. The FaZe camp, they were thinking, hey, this one's got to go our way. We can force the game 5. Dallas closes the door, and they later close out the hard point. Truly a very impressive weekend from the Dallas Empire. What was a previous 0-5 series record versus both Atlanta and Chicago has now wiped away. The young guns look great. The vets stepped up during the clutch moments, but the question from the start of the season has now been answered match by match by match. Was this the right group to bring together? Was Shotzzy worth it? Is Illy going to live up to the expectations? Can Crim and Clay still do it? Is Hook actually, can he become a champion? After being in so many grand finals previously, does he have what it takes? All the questions are starting to be answered, and they're starting to be answered in very dramatic ways. For me, there is no question who the best team in the world is. It has to be the Empire, right? They 3-0 Chicago in a dominant series. They 3-1 Atlanta, and the only map that they lose comes down to a round 11 1v1. The teams that you'd compare them to at this very moment are ones that they just got done taking down. If they were close, I can understand the argument, but based on the uptick for how much Dallas looks to be improving, I think that they remain at least in the top 2 position for a while, and right now currently sit at the number 1 spot. They were almost even with Chicago coming into this event for me in terms of power rankings, and they have surpassed expectations. They are the only team to win 2 championships in the CDL, one on LAN and the other online. They've been to 4 tournaments, not including launch weekend. They've been to 4 tournaments, and they've been in 3 grand finals in which they've had to face off against Chicago, Minnesota, and Atlanta. The direct competition that you would compare them with, they managed to beat, and in both convincing fashion. That's the biggest thing for me, right? If you want to say, oh, well, Dallas, it's kind of even. Who are you comparing them to? Right? Who are we throwing in the ring here? Are we throwing in Atlanta? You really can't do that. You want to throw in Chicago? Definitely can't do that. Who else is there? You want to argue Florida? Okay, fine. We can have that discussion for another day, but it's not going to happen. You can't argue online either. For the same reason we've talked previously about major championships. This is the highest level of competition that we have, and that we actually can have. If we had 2 forms of competition going on with an online pro league and LAN events, I get it, right? We have the online versus LAN debate. I would understand that. To say that one team is performing in pro league but not performing in a LAN environment, that is understandable. But this is now the standard. These matches are the highest level of competition that we humanly can have. If you want to hold on to previous LAN records, I'll see you in a few months. If you want to take online into consideration, realize that when we had just left LAN, Dallas was on top, beating Minnesota in LA, and the direct comparison that they had at that moment are 2 teams that they just beat convincingly in what has been labeled by the other rosters as a fair online match. And they beat them handily as well. The Dallas Empire are currently the number 1 team in the game, the new number 1 team in the game, and you cannot tell me otherwise. Given the circumstances, given the situations, the rosters that they have beat up to this point, and the consistency that they have had from LAN to online, this is by far the new number 1 team in the CDL.